Good morning. You can probably tell from the way I'm dressed that I'm not a fintech person. My skill and discipline is financial services, but we're working very closely with the UK's fintech community and the fintech trade bodies in a lot of the policy work that we're doing. Those of you that were here last year will recall me speaking briefly on Brexit and perhaps what we may be looking at. However, a few things have changed since then, I'm sure you're aware. We weren't anticipating a snap election. We weren't anticipating some of the other changes that have happened, which now means for us, when we're talking to regulators and policymakers, and particularly ministers, we're having to open dialogue with a number of new ministers and explain to them the work we've done so far and what our proposals may be for the industry, both the UK financial services industry and the fintech industry, in terms of how we cope with what the title of this session is Brexit. So where are we now? This session anticipates that in the press there's been an awful lot of positive comment on Brexit and what it may mean, and a lot of negative comment. And hopefully we can dispel some of that myth this morning to explain what's happening and what is perhaps nearer the truth in this situation. We're doing this at a particularly good time as we're wrestling with MiFID, PSD2, PRIPS, GDPR, and you guys are probably wrestling with open banking and APIs and wondering where they fit. So luckily this morning, I have three experts that I've managed to corral and bring here with me who are going to give us a synopsis of how they see the current situation, particularly for UK financial services and for the fintech community. So to my extreme right is Pamela Buxton from Hogan Lovells, who will give us a legal and compliance and regulatory perspective of where we've got to so far on Brexit and perhaps what the challenges and opportunities are for the future. Next to Pamela is Ruth Milligan from Tech UK. If you don't know Tech UK, you should do, so speak to Ruth afterwards. Tech UK represent UK fintechs and are the trade body that helps and does a lot of training and a lot of work to help support fintechs and the digital community. And and incidentally, if you got this morning's City AM, I think there was an article in there from Ruth on open banking and a lot of the work that she's doing there. And last, but by no means least, the male on my panel is David Dalton-Brown, who is my Director General at Tizer, heavily involved with government and regulators on a number of issues, but particularly Brexit. David, like myself, has a financial services background, but also his is more impressive, much more impressive than mine. He ran Fidelity and Fidelity's business and created £5 billion worth of revenue there. He currently chairs the UK's biggest online financial services organisation, as well as finding time in his busy week to be Director General of Tizer. So what I'm going to do is ask the three panellists to give their views currently as to where we are on Brexit and what's happening and what the challenges and opportunities are for you. Then I'm hoping that we can open it up to questions so that you get the opportunity to get involved in the dialogue and ask the questions that you want. So I'm going to ask David to kick off and give a view of UK financial services and the fintech community, some work that's been going on and where we've got to so far. David?
Hi, does this work? All right. Well, good afternoon, and I'm going to give you an overview of the work that Tizer has been involved in Brexit. Our work started obviously a year ago, and just over 80 of our member firms have contributed to the work. Very quickly, a bit about Tizer. You've probably not heard too much about us. We're an organisation that focuses on policy and industry infrastructure for good outcomes for consumers and UK PLC. We have 170 member firms that cover all of the major banks, all the major investment companies, building societies, wealth managers, the systems infrastructure companies such as Bank of New York, IFDS, and the distribution companies, and increasingly fintech companies are joining us. We work on a range of traditional policy, but also digital policy, and you'll probably see us in the press talking about digital IDs, because we're leading the project on building a digital ID for the UK at the moment with just over 60 of our member firms. But I say, a year ago, I woke up on holiday, pretty depressed like the rest of you, and took a range of phone calls from equally depressed people, including commissioners from the EU. One of them, I remember, crying on the phone at what had just happened. And my member said, you better get us together and talk about how we're going to handle this. So we worked together with our members to develop some policy proposals for governments and regulators on how, for the investment industry, just the investment industry, not banking, we would first retain and grow our EU business and trade globally post-Brexit. You've got to remember, it's the global opportunity as well as the challenge. A number of proposals come out of that, which we've shared with regulators and government, ongoing. That's a debate that's ongoing. And I should say we're working closely with the Investment Association and City UK on our work. We're trying to create a united front to government and regulators. But a number of things come out pretty early on. So the first thing, you have to have a starting place, is that if you look at the government papers, it's pretty clear you have to start from the premise that we're no longer going to be in the single market or the customs union. So if you start working on anything, you have to have a basis, and that is the place where we're starting. So we're out of the single market, and we're out of the customs union, and we have to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU. So what does that mean? Well, initially, that means that many businesses in the UK trade into the EU using passporting. That's not going to exist. And similarly, we remind ourselves, there's two-way flow, that the 7 of the EU countries deal very strongly and trade very strongly with the UK as a whole. And they use passporting. And of course, they can't use passporting anymore. So as we go into this, what is, and Ruth's going to give you more details on the legal side of this and regulatory side, but we have to go into this looking for a free trade agreement that allows us to trade with the EU, and the EU, very importantly, trade with us, because they need to, as much as we need to trade with them. You've got to remember we are the 5th richest country in the world, and we are their biggest global trading partner. We're Germany's biggest global trading partner. So it's a two-way negotiation, but politics always is noisy, and negotiation's noisy. So you start on the basis, how can we negotiate a free trade agreement? You have things like third country equivalents. That's interesting, but it's not perfect. But it's the principles there you could look at and say how you could develop that free trade agreement. And I'll say Ruth will talk a bit more about come up with some form of mutual recognition around that. The other areas which particularly interest the Fintech community, of course that's very interesting, Fintech, but the other areas, I'm picking a few now, is around talent. Obviously, access to EU talent in the UK is very important, but global talent. So we're working on proposals with government about streamlining the current visa regime. And if any of you have ever had to fill out a visa form to bring in someone from America or Australia or into a business, you'll realise it's a 200-page form, right? And you can only bring someone into the country into a specific role. So if you move them, you have to reapply. So it's not exactly the most flexible arrangement. So we're looking at those type of visa arrangements and how they can be streamlined in the UK, and obviously retaining the talent that we have from the EU. And the other area, before I pass over, is competition. A huge area for consideration. And this is an area which is tricky. You have to be careful what you say. But we must be clear that when we leave the EU, that we have a regulatory regime here which is the best in the world. It has a high level of integrity. And it's also responsive, so that we can get companies authorised here in a reasonable time and to allow them to trade effectively. And we need to have the right tax regime, because many of our competitors in Europe have tax regimes which they're talking about. You've seen them in the press in recent days adjusting their tax regimes to make it more attractive for businesses to move out of the UK. So when it comes to competitiveness, we have to be strong in regulation, but we have to have a process that enables rapid authorisation of companies. Not a year, but talk about months. I'll put my chin out there, because that's what our competitors are doing. And we have to have a tax regime which makes sure the UK remains attractive, because our competitors will want to create a regime which attracts companies, fintech companies, to them. So those are the key areas looked at. I wish I could give you more certainty. There isn't, but we continue to engage with regulators and government to talk about proposals, how we can move it forward.
David, can I just ask you, David, to explain and outline exactly where we are with the particular work we've done with the FCA and the regulators and so forth?
Remember, I am constrained in what I can't say. But where we are, the papers have been prepared and presented to both the Treasury teams who are putting this together, and we obviously meet with the regulators and share our views there. We get encouragement and further questions. So the dialogue is ongoing, and obviously working with the two ladies on my right, that dialogue continues. It's a question and answering dialogue, and that's how it works.
Thanks very much. Ruth, can I now come to you? Can you give us a view from your membership and from the fintech ecosystem, please?
Yes, thanks, Peter. And thank you for your introduction, by the way. I am Head of Financial Services and Payments at Tech UK, Ruth Milligan. And Tech UK, just to tell you a bit about who we are, is a trade body that represents the whole of the technology sector. So we have public services, private services. We deal with companies that sell into the health sector, defence, etc. But also, clearly, we deal with companies who are developing products and who are developing systems and information technology for use in the financial services industry. And that is my particular area. So what I would say when it comes to what can the financial services sector do about Brexit and what should we be worrying about, what should we be doing, I think that what needs to happen is that we actually step up and we talk about what the fintech sector and what the financial services sector needs on an ongoing basis, and not just, within the outcome that might happen in 18 months' time, but over the long run, because the financial services industry is an interlinked industry, and it's interlinked globally, but it's very much interlinked European-wise, and we have to maintain those links, and we have to see ourselves as a sector which really doesn't have boundaries, because it is a digital world that we are living in, and therefore we cannot have artificial borders, because it will strangle the financial services sector. So what we at Tech UK have been trying to do is to speak to as many people as possible. Fintech, in my mind, is a sector which has enormous interest and its own enormous potential and innovation, but it will come to, technology is coming to be financial services. You can't do any financial services without technology. So we are the same sector, and we must speak with one voice across the incumbents and the new players, and also speak as much as possible to our counterparts in other EU member states, which is what we've been doing as Tech UK. In fact, recently we were in Dublin talking to some of the financial industry players there and saying, look, it's in both of our interests to make sure that we have a good outcome. Further from that, I think for us, the point already mentioned is that, people are hugely important. An industry is people. And London is seen as the fintech capital of Europe, and that's marvelous, but there are reasons for that, and the reasons partly are because we have a fabulous financial conduct authority which is extremely open, which has done a great deal to help new and establishing companies to get on with the regulator, to understand the regulations, and to get their businesses started. And that is something that we want to continue to be able to do. We want companies from all over Europe and all over the world to come and set up in not just London, obviously, but the whole of the UK. And therefore, we need to be sure that we don't cut ourselves off in any way. And Pamela is going to speak a bit more about how that might be done. But from our point of view, I think it's a lot to do with tone, it's a lot to do with how you approach our counterparts in the EU. I personally worked in Brussels for a number of years, and the institutions in Brussels are convoluted, they are difficult, they are by no means perfect, but they operate by rules that have been the rules of a club for decades. And I think the UK has to understand that these are rules which we need to be aware of, and we need to play with and within. And therefore, it's very important that we approach this as a collaborative exercise, and that the UK understands that there are things which probably the EU simply cannot do, because there are 27 of them and they'd all have to agree, and that is a very difficult process, And it certainly very seldom could be done in 18 months. So one thing other I would say is that what we need to have in mind is that we would like to see a transition period, that the idea that everything can be done in 18 months is really not on. And so therefore one of the main things would be to understand, well, this is a process that will have to continue for longer, and how do we agree on how that happens? So I think these are the main areas that we want to focus on, the skills that we must continue to be welcoming, and that the arrangements that are made for people who are here in the UK or who might come to the UK in the next 18 months from other EU countries and from outside are welcoming, and that therefore we continue to attract all you fabulous companies who come to London to set up as fintechs. Because to my mind, you know, the technology it benefits from a mix of cultures. It benefits from a mix of viewpoints from across all sorts of different cultures, and that's what makes it so alive, and that's what gives it its real impetus. So apart from that, I think making a noise as much as possible, thinking about the continuing transition process, and also thinking about how we as the UK can continue to offer venture capital to companies and startups that come here. And we will lose some funding from the European Investment Bank, and we need to think about how we can make up for that. But the other thing that I just want to mention to finish with is standards. So a lot of technology advances have to have standards to be interoperable across communities. Open banking is a very strong candidate for that. And the UK is currently leading in its thinking on open banking. We have taken up open APIs. We are doing that far more quickly and strongly than any other of the EU countries, as far as I know. And one of the main things that's really important for the other EU countries is to get some kind of linked up structure for open banking. And the UK is doing that within the UK. So this is a pattern that we can share with our other EU colleagues and counterparts. So I think it's crucial to say that we want to continue to be in the discussions. We need to be there in whatever forum that can be possibly done. If we lose passporting, we want to have something which allows us to do the same kind of things. And I think overall that would be the message from Tech UK.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Very, very insightful view from the technology community. Finally, moving to Pam. Hogan Lovells, not just lawyers and one of London's leading legal firms, but heavily involved in digital and fintech in the work that they do. So can we have a legal view, please, Pam?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, and in fact, Hogan Lovells has been looking at the issues associated with Brexit since David Cameron got his unexpected majority and how times have changed since then. So we're now moving on. I thought I would just give you a bit more of the technical legal side of things. where are we now, what happens next, and what should you be doing? Well, the fun has really begun. There's certainly 3 big work streams to be done. There's looking at the UK legal framework and ensuring that continues to be fit for purpose, agreeing the terms of our exit or withdrawal agreement, and also looking at putting in place these bespoke trading arrangements that we will regulate our relationship going forward. And all of that whilst maintaining our leading position as a financial services and fintech hub. On the home front, I think it's worth, a lot of fintechs, will be focused, certainly in the startup phase, on the domestic market, and looking at the fact of what's going to change here. And I think first thing to note is nothing until Brexit happens. The current regulatory environment will continue. Obligations to adapt to MiFID II, PSD2, and embrace open banking, that's all coming along. And the good news is that that's not effort which is wasted, because the government is planning to import all of the EU laws into UK domestic law under the no longer Great Repeal Bill, but the Repeal Bill which is going to be published on Thursday. And that will give us a bit of insight, a bit more clarity as to the adaptations, as they're calling them, that will be made. There's no intention to change policy, so again, it's still going to be continuing the status quo, but the adaptations will change things in a way that we may not expect, and I think it's incumbent all of us within the industry to keep an eye and make sure that that's working the way that we want it to work. There's also the ongoing need to maintain alignment for access to the EU, and our regulators have always said there's no prospect of a bonfire of regulations on Brexit. So in terms of the domestic market, and subject to the new risks and opportunities that are being introduced, the regulatory and legal environment should continue. In relation to cross-border access, for those of you who are looking at trade across markets, and as Ruth says, that very much with tech, the regulatory borders are increasingly something which we need to overcome and find solutions for and work together. And I think it's really encouraging to see Brexit as a catalyst and to see fintech as a catalyst for creating these global interoperable standards. But at the moment, we rely on passporting rights in order to create, to access cross-border, and those rights lapse automatically at the end of the 2-year period, unless something is done to put something else in place within that period. So this is not something which we will happen to us or done. It's just that is the course we're on. So we need to ensure that something is put in place in order to maintain that access. Transition will be important. At the moment, there's no real clarity over what that transition arrangement will look like, how long it will last for, but there is definitely a commitment on both sides to put that in place. I think it's worth just touching quickly, because there seems to be there's quite a lot of confusion between access to the single market and membership of the single market, and really just to focus on the fact that from our perspective as an industry, what we're looking for is that you can obtain an authorization for a regulated activity in one market that will allow you to access all of the other markets that you want to trade in across the EEA. And that's the essence of it. At the moment, you can get that as an EU member, you can get that as a member of the EEA, and what we're looking for is a structure where, working together and collaboratively, we can find a way that we can recognise the EU's authorisations and the EU can recognise our authorisations in order to preserve that continuity. The proposal is for a free trade agreement, and we will be breaking new ground really there, because at the moment, free trade agreements with the EU don't cover financial services in any detail. But we are starting from a unique position of being integrated and very much aligned as at day one. So all to play for in terms of that. As we all know, the negotiations have started, and they operate within the sort of 3 key legal contexts: the UK's legal and constitutional constraints, the EU's legal and constitutional constraints, and actually the World Trade Organization's rules. If we want to create a free trade agreement that works between the two of us, it needs to have substantial sectoral coverage, covers a variety of sectors, and that's a good thing from the perspective of everyone's objective is to put in place something which works for us all. So just thinking, what should you all be doing now? I mean, I think the first thing is obviously to look at which EU rights you're relying on. Passporting, the Bank of England is actually a requirement if you're relying on that to submit your contingency plans by Thursday this week, so they're presumably all in the post. And then very much re-emphasise the need to engage with the process and to support the negotiators. And we have a really illustrious team of trade negotiators at Hogan Lovells, Ambassador Maruyama, who is in the US, led the US contingent for the Uruguay round, and Ambassador Powman, who led the EU team. And they are, absolutely clear that the level of investment and energy that a sector puts into supporting the trade negotiators and understanding what their needs are, and indeed how that actually, demonstrating the commonality of interest and how that benefits the other side is how to secure your priorities in those negotiations. So I think, just to end on another positive note, Brexit is definitely increasing the focus on fintech. Within the UK, it's a world-leading export, and therefore the government will be looking to support that as we go forward. And so this is your opportunity to really engage and let the government know what it is you want from them, as Ruth says, not just for Brexit, but for life.
Thanks very much, Pam. I'm looking closely at my host to see, do we have time for questions, or we're out of time? My panel is actually around after this session and over lunch, so you'll be able to ask your questions then rather than now. Sorry we couldn't get questions in at the end, but it was always going to be a hell of a challenge to try and cover that subject in the time we've allocated. So thanks very much.